Rafael destroyed part of a historic building and now faces consequences that will change his life forever. I never imagined that a simple metallic snap could completely change the course of my life. It was just another day at work at that historic building restoration company, a place that until then had represented stability, routine, and security for me. The smell of lime, damp wood, and paint was part of my daily routine, and I had grown accustomed to that setting of dust and ancient beauty. I was known for being agile, quick to make decisions, the kind of employee who didn't wait for orders to act. But this haste, this desire to solve everything at once, ended up being the trigger for my greatest downfall. When I heard the snapping sound coming from the structure I was working on, my heart raced. For a moment, I thought it was just a fright, but within seconds, I realized I had damaged something much bigger than a piece of wood. I had compromised part of a listed structure, and, with it, all the trust the team had in me. In the following minutes, the construction site descended into chaos. Voices clashed, eyes surrounded me, and all I could hear was one phrase hammering away inside my head. "It was you, Rafael." It pierced me. I tried to justify it, to say the project was poorly designed, the reports confusing, but deep down, I knew my inattention had cost me dearly. The director, Carlos, came to me with a heavy expression. He didn't shout, didn't accuse. He simply said, firmly, "Rafael, what you did could destroy months of work and a piece of this city's history." I was speechless. For the first time, I felt the true weight of the responsibility I carried in my hands, and I realized that, until then, I had never truly understood what preserve meant. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the office was almost unbearable. Paula, the engineer overseeing the reports, avoided looking at me. Anna, my shift colleague, seemed torn between compassion and fear of getting involved. Conversations stopped when I entered. The sound of the keyboard, previously constant, was now piercing. The news had already reached the Conservation Authority, and Inspector Isabella would come personally to assess the damage. I slept poorly, waking up sweating, reliving that cracking sound every night. I felt ashamed, anger at myself, and a suffocating fear of what was to come. I was called to an emergency meeting with the board, and each step toward the room seemed to take me further away from the life I knew. Inside, it wasn't just Rafael being judged. It was the man who had to face, for the first time, the consequences of his own impulses. As I sat across from Carlos, Lucas, and João, I noticed how tense everyone was. The table felt like a silent battlefield. Lucas, the project manager, tried to maintain a diplomatic tone, but his fatigue showed. João, the head of accounting, looked at me with an expression that mixed pity and disapproval. "The company will have to pay heavy fines," Carlos said, and that plural in the company stinged because I knew it was my fault. He could have fired me right then and there, and perhaps that would have been fair. But instead, he took a deep breath and said, "You're going to have to help me fix this, Rafael. And more importantly, you're going to have to prove that you've learned the meaning of responsibility." I didn't understand it right away, but that sentence would become the beginning of my rebuilding. I left that room shattered. The pride that had always accompanied me seemed to have evaporated. On the way back to the construction site, every brick, every wall, every detail of the building seemed to be watching me. For the first time, I felt like I could truly lose everything: my job, the trust of my colleagues, and my self-respect. And it was there, in that heavy silence, that the penny dropped. I could no longer be the guy who rushed everything, who let his ego rule. I had hurt something that couldn't be replaced: history. And somehow I realized that if I wanted to stay there, I would need to rebuild something even more difficult than a damaged structure. I would need to rebuild myself. In the following days, I was temporarily removed from work at the construction site. The decision was fair, but it hurt. The routine that had once consumed me now felt lost. I stayed home, mentally reviewing every move, Every hasty decision, trying to understand the exact moment I had crossed the line between confidence and recklessness. Messages from colleagues stopped. The team group, where jokes and photos of daily life had previously circulated, was now silent to me. The isolation was cruel. I realized how much I depended on it to feel like I belonged. I felt the weight of invisible judgment, and the worst part was that deep down, no one hated me more than I hated myself. I kept repeating out loud, "How could I have done this?" The question echoed, unanswered, as if each echo pushed me a little deeper into the pit. In the midst of this silence, I received an unexpected call from Carlos. He asked me to come to his office. His voice was calm but firm. I felt nervous. When I arrived, I saw that he had placed several folders, reports, and old plans of the damaged building on the table. "Sit down," he said. "I want to show you exactly what was affected." For almost 2 hours he explained the historical value of the piece, the impact of the damage, and the meticulous restoration process. I could barely look up. Then he said something that resonated deeply with me. "To err is human, Rafael, but to ignore what error teaches is a choice." I left that room with a lump in my throat. For the first time, it wasn't shame that dominated me. It was a genuine desire to learn and change. From that day on, I began to study on my own. I spent hours reading about preservation techniques, the invisible layers of an ancient structure, and the symbolic value each detail holds. I wanted to understand what I had previously treated as mere task execution. I discovered a new respect for patience, one I'd never possessed. I returned to visit the construction site, even though I couldn't work directly. I would stand there, watching Anna and Paula cautiously resume their work. At first, they avoided me, and I understood, but gradually I realized that my quiet presence, my less defensive posture, was beginning to speak for me. I was learning the value of listening, of accepting time, of respecting the process. It was Miguel, the former construction manager who had been fired months earlier, who helped me see something I hadn't seen before. He showed up one day to settle some issues with HR and recognized me in the hallway. "I heard what happened," he said. I expected criticism, but he just continued. "Sometimes we only learn to be careful when we feel the weight of having broken something that we can't fix with our own hands." That sentence shattered me. I began to see the mistake not just as a punishment, but as a mirror. Miguel showed me that within that disaster there was a chance to rebuild not the wall, but the man who damaged it. And that's when I began to truly rebuild. I asked to return, even if it was just to help with cleaning, cataloging, or document review. Carlos agreed with one condition: I want commitment, not rushing. And so I returned, silently, without the right to public apologies or acknowledgement. The first few days were difficult. Every glance pierced my skin. Some thought I was there out of pity, others said it was for lack of options, but deep down I knew I was there for myself. And as I became more involved in the smaller tasks, something inside me began to reorganize. I learned that humility is not the opposite of strength, it is its foundation. And the more I accepted this new role, the more I felt I was finally beginning to rebuild my own structure. Over time, I began to realize that the hardest part wasn't the physical work, but the emotional one. Being back in the place where it all happened brought me face to face with my ghosts. Every detail of the damaged structure was a silent reminder of my mistake. Sometimes I would stop in front of the place and just stare for a few minutes, like someone staring into a mirror of shame and learning. Paula gradually started to get closer. One day, while I was cataloging the reports, she sat next to me and said, "We make mistakes, Rafael. What matters is what comes next." That gave me a breath of hope. I realized that trust isn't restored with words, but with consistency, and that's what I set out to do. Show up every day, do my job to the best of my ability, without rushing, without trying to prove anything, just being present. Still, There were times when guilt engulfed me. At night, the sound of the crack returned like a recurring nightmare. I would wake up sweating, feeling like the wall was caving in on me. At these times, I wondered if I truly deserved a second chance. It was Anna who realized this first. One day she found me sitting alone in the courtyard and said, "You have to stop punishing yourself. The mistake was huge, but you're already paying for it. Now you have to live." That phrase stuck in my head for days. Little by little, I began to understand that my punishment was no longer useful, that continuing to wallow in guilt only kept me trapped in the past. And little by little, I began to accept that starting over was also a way to make amends. A new challenge arose when Isabella, the Preservation Authority inspector, returned to reassess the site. I was present, but avoided eye contact. When she recognized me, she simply nodded. I expected a harsh critique, but instead, she said something unexpected. "I see the work is being redone with great care. That's what matters now." It was a simple phrase, but loaded with meaning. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was recognition of the effort. I felt a pang of relief, and I realized that perhaps in some way I was beginning to transform my image from one of destruction to one of reconstruction. Over time, Lucas began to trust me again. He was the most rigid, the most demanding, and perhaps the one who suffered the most from the financial consequences of my mistake. One day, he called me in to review a new project, and before handing me the sheets, he said, "I trust you to get this right now." That, coming from him, meant a lot. I didn't need to say anything, just nodded. I felt like that was the first solid brick in the new foundation I was building. For the first time in months, I left work with a different feeling, not of guilt, but of purpose. I began to see that overcoming obstacles isn't a sudden leap, it's a ladder, and each step requires humility and patience. Time passed, and the building, little by little, took on a new form. Each restored part seemed to also symbolize a part of me that was being reassembled. I began arriving earlier, staying later, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to be there, to see the process unfold, to be part of every detail. My colleagues began to include me in their conversations again. The jokes returned little by little. That cold atmosphere began to warm up again, and I realized that collective forgiveness didn't come all at once. It was built in practice, day after day. And when finally I looked at the restored structure and saw that it was strong, beautiful, and preserved, I felt an emotion I had never felt before. True pride. Not of having fixed what I had broken, but of having transformed myself in the process. As the months passed, my routine stabilized again, but something inside me was no longer the same. I had learned to slow down, to breathe before acting, to respect the timing of things. Every nail, every plan review, every conversation with the team carried a different weight now. And it was in this more conscious pace that I realized how much I had neglected the essence of my work before. Restoring a historic building wasn't just about dealing with cement and brick. It was about dealing with memories, with stories that had stood the test of time. And somehow, that began to intertwine with my own journey. I was also trying to restore myself layer by layer, learning to deal with the internal cracks that until then I had hidden behind haste and arrogance. One late afternoon, Carlos called me in for a chat. It had been a while since that tense meeting that had changed everything. He greeted me with a discreet but sincere smile. "You've changed, Rafael," he said, "and not just as a professional, you've changed as a person. I see it in the way you carry yourself, in your attention to every detail." I remained silent, unsure of how to respond. He then added, "The mistake you made was serious, but what you did afterward was even more important." In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Recognition. Not the kind of recognition that feeds the ego, but the kind that heals an old wound. That of feeling irrelevant. From that day on, I began to be assigned to smaller projects, but with more autonomy. Lucas included me in decision-making, Paula asked me for technical input, and even Anna joked that I was now the patience inspector. It seemed small, but to me, it was immense. I realized how each gesture was a way of saying, "We trust you again." And that's when I understood something fundamental. Trust isn't a prize you earn, it's a bond you build. And if I wanted to honor that, I needed to stay strong, even when the memories of the mistake came back to haunt me. Despite the progress, there was a day when everything seemed to fall apart again. During a routine inspection, a technical report was questioned by an external inspector, and the problem was once again blamed on me. At that moment, I felt that old sinking feeling in my stomach, the same one I'd felt when I'd made the original mistake. Voices in the room rose, and glances grew heavy. Again, but this time I took a deep breath and remained calm. I took the documents, reviewed them line by line, and discovered that the error stemmed from a typo in the system. I showed them, explained clearly, and the tension dissipated. Carlos looked at me, somewhat surprised, and simply said, "That's how it's done." It was a small moment, but for me, it was huge. I had proven to myself that I was no longer the same impulsive man I'd been before. That night, on my way home, I stopped in front of an old building along the way. I stared at the windows, the cracks, the marks of time. I thought about how structures, even damaged ones, could still hold beauty and meaning. That's how I saw myself now, scarred, but still standing. I understood that overcoming mistakes doesn't erase them, but transforms them into the foundation for something more solid. For the first time in a long time, I looked at myself with tenderness. Not as the man who failed, but as the man who had the courage to change. Over time, my attitude began to be reflected in my colleagues as well. The initial tension turned to respect, and gradually to admiration. I was no longer the impulsive employee, but someone who learned to listen, analyze, and consider. The team began to consult me before making important decisions, and I felt my voice carried weight, but now it wasn't out of arrogance, it was out of experience and responsibility. This change gave me a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. For the first time, I realized that my mistakes could serve as a warning and a learning experience for others, not just as a punishment for myself. Even with progress, the guilt never completely disappeared. There were still moments when I relived that cracking sound, that feeling of helplessness and shame, but I learned to transform those moments into strength. Each time the memory arose, I took a deep breath and recalled everything I did afterward. The effort to study, the effort to regain confidence, the careful repair of the damage. It was a way of honoring the mistake and making it useful, a reminder that failure can be the starting point for real and profound change. On the last major project I participated in, leading a smaller restoration, I realized I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not Carlos, not Lucas, not my colleagues. What mattered was my commitment to history, to the building, and to myself. When I finished, I looked at the work and felt a genuine silent pride. The sense of responsibility, well assumed, was far more valuable than any external recognition. There, I understood that true overcoming isn't about forgetting the past, but learning from it and moving forward with greater awareness and determination. Today, when I think about that initial moment, the crack, the damaged wall, the despair I felt, I see that it was the biggest wake-up call of my life. If I had continued at the same pace, with haste and arrogance, I probably wouldn't be here telling my story. The mistake forced me to face my flaws, to listen, to observe, to rebuild myself with patience and dedication. I discovered that responsibility, humility, and perseverance are values learned through pain, but that sustain any future trajectory. By sharing this story, I want my readers to understand something simple yet profound. Mistakes don't define us, but how we react to them does. Today, I continue working, learning, and rebuilding not only historic buildings, but also my own history. I'm not perfect. I still carry scars. I still fear failure, but I've learned that overcoming obstacles is possible when we have the courage to face ourselves. My journey isn't over, but now I know I can finally walk with my head held high.